Hey y'all, and welcome to Flick Connection, where in less time than you normally spend scrolling for something to watch every night, I'm going to tell you about 20 of the most visually stunning movies you can currently catch on Netflix. Now, I did do a list similar to this one back in the spring, and I'll link to that down in the top pinned comment, where you can also find the full list of all the movies discussed in this video. Thanks to Sundays for sponsoring this episode, but my number 20 pick is easily one of the most visually striking movies on this list, but listen closely because Bardo is not for everyone. Or rather, Bardo, False Chronicle of a Handful of Truths, is a high art film. It's actually directed by Alejandro Iñárritu, who's most famous for Birdman and The Revenant. And the cinematography in this movie is really just unparalleled. And the movie itself is almost like either a dream or an acid trip, call it what you want, but it's that type of a movie. Now, there are some points made along the way. There's actually quite a bit, but there's no real strong narrative, and so this is really only for the art film crowd, but as part of that crowd, I personally really enjoyed this one. Now don't worry, I do have some crowd pleasers on this list, quite a few in fact. In fact, most of them are, but my next pick is another art film not for everybody. However, it's a really cool one that I do think a select few of you are gonna love. The Bad Batch is almost like a post-apocalyptic survival movie, except it takes place in sort of a quarantine zone where people are sent, almost like prisoners are sent, kind of like Escape from New York, except it's out in the desert and there's cannibals and Jason Momoa's there. Keanu Reeves is kind of running the place, and then Jim Carrey gives one of the best little cameos I think I've ever seen in a movie. This one's got a really cool soundtrack, kind of an amazing look to it. But again, it is for the art film crowd. It's very strange, and it's just not going to connect with a lot of folks. But if you do like weirder movies, The Bad Batch is definitely one of them. All right, next up we've got Elysium, which is a movie I do like, but the reason it's so far back on the list is I loved Neil Blomkamp's first film, District 9, so much, and thought somehow Elysium was going to be even better. At least the story and setup seemed like there was a potential there. And I didn't feel like this movie was glued together nearly as tightly as District 9, and therefore I didn't quite enjoy it as much. But still, this movie is stacked with some incredible visuals and a solid concept at its core. I just felt like this movie could have been a lot better than it was. Another movie I wanted a little more from was Lucy, starring Scarlett Johansson.
We've merely slipped a little package into your lower tummy.
And you're going to transport something very special to us.
This is actually directed by Luc Besson, who's famous for really badass movies like La Femme Nikita, Leon the Professional, The Fifth Element. And Lucy's kind of a combination of some of his greatest hits, yet it's not as good as any of them. Now, Scarlett Johansson is great, and in fact, I love the setup for this movie. The way it gets started, I think is really incredible. And then it stays pretty interesting. Ultimately, the place that it goes to, I thought was almost too weird for me, which is really saying something, but still, this is kind of a wild ride, and it's not an epically long movie either. You can watch this one pretty quickly and then be done with it. This is one of those movies that I did enjoy, but have no desire to, see a sequel or anything. Cannot say that for my next pick, which is a Netflix original. In fact, it was an early Netflix original, and I really wish they had made a sequel to this. It's not too late, they could. And honestly, they should make a sequel to Spectral. I also did a sci-fi Netflix list in the summertime, and a lot of people were upset that this movie was not included. I only skipped it because I have included it on sci-fi lists in the past, but it has been a while, and if you have not seen this one, it is a really cool Netflix original. In fact, I think had it come out today, or somewhat recently, it would have been a bigger hit. They really just released it kind of early before Netflix was producing a lot of original content, or at least a lot of big budget original content like this. But this movie's kind of like a mix between Black Hawk Down and, I don't know, an episode of Scooby-Doo. If that sounds the least bit intriguing, definitely check out Spectral. Obviously, it's got cool visuals, that's why it's on the list, but it's somewhat of a modern warfare movie mixed with a supernatural element that I thought actually delivered. It's strange, but oddly kind of makes sense, and then ultimately ends up being just a delivery device for all these cool visuals, but again, the story works. I know Spectral's not high up on the list, but it's still a very strong recommendation.
Hey, buddy. Got the good stuff.
Oh,
is funny?
No, sir! No, sir!
And then kind of a surprising one to find on this list is Colombiana, starring Zoe Saldana. This is a cool PG-13 action movie. I tend to not love PG-13 movies like this that are hyper-violent because it just, something doesn't feel right. Colombiana, though, is surprisingly violent for a PG-13 movie. I recall rewatching it last year and being really shocked at how brutal the movie can be. And it's really slick and cool at the same time. Zoe is always a blast to watch. And then the reason it's such a surprise on this list is you wouldn't expect this movie to be half as visually pleasing as it is. The placement of my next pick on the list is going to baffle some of you. Some of you are going to think it's placed way too high, probably shouldn't even be on the list, and others think it should probably be ranked much higher than it is, but I do think Darren Aronofsky's Black Swan is a heavily flawed movie. Now, it makes the list because it does have a striking visual style. Now, at times, it's just sort of gray and drab, but at moments, it really punches and is kind of shocking. And I'll say, one review I heard of this movie back when it was originally released is that it's a very well-made, bad movie, and I kind of get that. I agree. The plot and the concept is almost something you would find in a really terrible movie like Mystery Science Theater 3000, yet it's produced at almost the highest level in Hollywood. This too is technically an art film in that respect, but Natalie Portman and really the whole cast, they're not just doing good acting. It's like almost as good as you can get at times in this movie. The same goes for the cinematography, which is why it makes the list. And just ultimately the way that, again, kind of a wonky, bad concept is glued together is kind of magical in this movie. But it does get beat out by the Super Mario Brothers movie. Sorry folks that love that movie. I really enjoyed the Super Mario Brothers movie with my kids. If you have not watched it, I can promise you it is a blast. There's a ton of nostalgia in there, and it's funny at the same time. You wouldn't really expect it to be. If you've got kids, you need to see it. If you don't, and you've ever played Super Mario Brothers, I can tell you this is a fun movie to watch. But my number 12 pick is not really fun to watch at all, but I still really enjoyed Prometheus. Now this too, I think, is heavily flawed, and as a movie nerd, I've watched countless videos on the flaws and the brilliance of Prometheus, and it's got both in spades, which is kind of odd that it does a lot of things so terribly and other things really wonderfully. One of them being Michael Fassbender's performance as the android David is really unmatched in this movie. And the whole cast is great, but his David is just really incredible. And then sort of the vague concepts of the origin of the aliens, or at least possible origins of these xenomorph aliens, was very interesting to me. Getting to see the space jockey finally, all of that in Prometheus I thought was incredible, and the movie looks absolutely amazing. Again, there's just some wonky stuff in it that I think kind of held it back from true greatness. Still, I find it to be a really fantastic watch, and again, it's one of the more visually stunning movies you're going to catch on Netflix right now. All right, rounding out my bottom 10 on this list is another Netflix original, an award-winning Netflix original, All Quiet on the Western Front. Now this takes place in World War I, but Netflix has been producing a lot of World War II content, and quite a lot of it is quite good. Now while this is World War I, I'd put it in a similar genre, and I say all that to say that this is easily one of the best things that they've produced in this genre. Visually, it's absolutely breathtaking. Even the grimmer moments just have an incredible look to them. That's why it makes the list. But also the story is really well told. Now, it's an old story. It's based on a book, and they made a very good movie in 1930. And this one conveys the same concepts, but to a modern audience, and I think it conveys all of those concepts of war incredibly well. In fact, they're concepts I think a lot of war movies strive for. Some succeed, but All Quiet on the Western Front just succeeds where a lot of others fail. Now, there's plenty more movies to discuss on this list, but first I want to tell you about how today's sponsor, Sundays, actually extended the life of my dog, Peanut. which is actually air-dried dog food that contains 90% human-grade meat, meaning meat safe for you and I to eat. The other 10% is just vegetables, with no synthetic ingredients. And unlike other fresh dog food brands, Sundays is shelf-stable, just like regular kibble, because it's been air-dried. You simply just pour it in the bowl, and there's no messy prep or cleanup. I know from experience, other fresh dog food brands can start to spoil after a while, or have a smell, or just be kind of a hassle, and you get none of that with Sundays. Plus, they can save you money. Sundays delivers directly to your door, which means you don't have to buy dog food again, and because it's air-dried, they don't have to spend extra money on refrigeration cost, saving you a significant amount of money. In fact, Sundays cost 40% less than other fresh dog food brands, but for a limited time, my viewers are going to save 50% off on top of that already great price when they just go to the link in the video description down below, or just type in sundaysfordogs.com/flick. Not only is that a fantastic deal, but you'll also be giving your dog the nutrition they need that you know they're not getting from regular dog food. Again, to get that discount, use my link in the description below. But speaking of great stuff, let's talk about the rest of the movies on this list. All right, now we're in the top 10, and most of my top 10 aren't just visually stunning, they're also insanely entertaining. Some of the most entertaining movies you can catch on Netflix right now. My number 10 pick being Love and Monsters. Now, this is a movie that was released during the pandemic and was a real surprise for me. The concept is this post-apocalyptic world where giant insects and amphibians are ruling the world, but this is a kind of PG-13 teen action adventure movie, and as one, it is absolutely incredible. I feel like teen action adventure movies tend to cut a lot of corners and end up being not very valuable, or really not rewatchable at the very least, and Love and Monsters is highly rewatchable. Dylan O'Brien carries the movie. He does a great job. He's really charismatic and is fun to watch, but the way that all the tension builds and everything is really top-notch filmmaking, and again, a movie that conceptually is kind of a bad movie. It's a big bug movie, but it's just really well done, and every single moment of it is thoroughly entertaining. So if you clicked on this wanting a visual feast, but also to be really entertained, and somehow you skipped this one too. It's my number 10 pick, but it's a very strong recommendation. All right, my number 9 pick is one I plan on rewatching this weekend myself. I've got a new sound system in theater set up in my living room, and I'm gonna just really test it out with Dread. Now, this is one I've seen several times, but my goodness, it's a wild ride. It's almost like a cyberpunk version of The Raid. It's got nothing to do with the original Stallone movie. Carl Urban plays Judge Dredd and does, I think, a much better job than Stallone, and don't get me wrong, I love Sylvester Stallone. But man, this movie's got this gritty cyberpunk thing, and it all takes place in this one building, which allowed them to get away with a lower budget, but man, the action just moves in this. Now, I will say, with it being as similar as it is to The Raid, I do think The Raid is a much better movie, but still, Dredd is a badass action movie with tons of action, some really wild and surprising moments, a pretty killer villain, and a visual style that is almost unmatched even on this list. Steven Spielberg comes in with one at number 8, even though he's got a few on Netflix right now, but for this particular list, I chose Catch Me If You Can.
How may I help you?
I'd like to cash this check here, and then I'd like to take you out for a steak dinner.
Now, this is one that has held up with time. It is just as fun to watch today as it was back when it came out. And it's the true story of one of the greatest con men of all time. Obviously, DiCaprio's great, but you get a really amazing role from Christopher Walken as his father in this movie, and Tom Hanks is really as funny as he ever is in this movie. But it's also this stunning, colorful trip through the 1960s. The movie looks almost like it was filmed in Technicolor at times, with the sets and the costumes, and just all of it pops. And it's just this top-tier Steven Spielberg production. I will say, it's one of the more fun movies I think Spielberg has ever done. My number 7 pick is the only movie from my previous visually striking movies on Netflix list to make it on this one, because it is such a strong recommendation, and I know I've got a lot of new subscribers since I posted that last video. This one was the biggest hit from India released in the last few years, RRR. Or at least it became one of the biggest. It was a big hit here in the US as well, and I'm sure around the world. It's still available on Netflix, and you want to talk about a wild ride, this is certainly one of them. And this is a long, epic movie. The action in it is filmed in a way that does not look like an American movie, which may sound like an obvious statement, but when you watch the movie, you will notice a different visual style, and it's absolutely breathtaking, even if it's way over the top and almost, again, too weird for me at times, but that's also kind of what makes it cool. And there's a story there too that is top-notch stuff. Again, it's big, it's epic. 2, I believe, musical numbers, which is a popular thing in India. As an American, it does seem out of left field because this movie's not a musical, yet they jump into musical numbers in the movie. But there's brutal action mixed in. If you just want to check out something new and interesting, you cannot go wrong with RRR unless, I don't know, you're just opposed to any violence at all, and if that's the case, you're going to miss out on most of the movies on this list. Then at my number 6 spot, the only other animated movie on this list, the hit of the summer, Spider-Man Across the Spiderverse. Now, this one maybe should have even been ranked as number 1 in terms of just visual style. It is one of the most visually striking movies I have ever seen, and if you've been following me for a long time, you know I've seen a lot of movies. Even if you don't care anything about Spider-Man, it could be well worth watching. The storytelling is also fantastic in this. I did think it got a little bit long-winded, whereas they could have trimmed it down a little bit, even without removing scenes. There's a couple that go a little bit over long, making this a very long animated movie with a cliffhanger and a second part due to come out next year. And the movie's every bit as fun and entertaining as some of the other ones around this point on the list. But the style they were able to get away with this movie is just kind of unbelievable. If you somehow just thought this was just going to be another Spider-Man movie, I'm here to tell you, you're sorely mistaken. There's a lot more meat on the bone with this movie. Definitely check it out. Now, my next 2 are the least visually stunning movies on this list, but I've ranked these in terms of how good I think the movies are. My next pick being LA Confidential. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a good-looking movie. It's a top-tier production, so everything looks really good. But it's also sort of this beautiful, glossy representation of this particular era in Los Angeles, or Hollywood, for that matter. It was actually nominated for a bunch of Academy Awards, and it's just a solid cop movie. You wouldn't quite call this film noir, but it's reminiscent of it in a lot of ways and does so with a bit of flair, which is why it actually gets placed on this list. There's several moments in this movie that are really striking, particularly the shootout towards the end of the movie. I would say if it's been a while since you've seen it, this one has held up surprisingly well, and with it being so close to Christmas time, the movie itself takes place during the Christmas season, although you wouldn't call it a Christmas movie. Okay, I'm just now noticing this because I don't pay attention to this when I make these lists, but Russell Crowe starred in LA Confidential. He stars in my next pick and another one before we get to number 1. My next pick being Cinderella Man. This is the true story of James Braddock, who was a washed-up boxer during the Great Depression, and when he was unable to take care of his family, he goes back into boxing and became this incredible comeback story. Now, this movie does have a beautiful look to it, even though it does take place in the Depression era. He spends either a lot of time working on providing for his family in the ring, or spends that time with his family, so the movie itself has kind of a warmth, and it's directed by Ron Howard, so you're getting it top-tier production. Russell Crowe's great, but Paul Giamatti as his coach and manager is one of my favorite characters in the movie. And this one just has some incredible moments in it. I strongly recommend everyone watching this video to check this movie out, especially if you haven't seen it. It's one of my favorite sports movies, and it's one of those sports movies where you don't need to know anything about boxing, and you certainly don't need to care anything about it in order to really get into Cinderella Man. Okay, my next one's gonna surprise some of you, but I'm telling you, James Gunn's The Suicide Squad is way more than a visual feast, and it definitely is that. This is a bold, colorful movie, yet it feels so different from any other superhero movie I think I've ever seen. It's got this amazing tone to it where it almost feels like a solid 1980s action movie, yet it's got this modern day sense of humor and wit. John Cena, this is easily my favorite role he's ever done, hands down. Idris Elba kind of leads the movie. Even though Margot's doing Harley Quinn in it, she's only got a few scenes and they're good, but this is really kind of a buddy movie and I love it. I think it's a ton of fun. It's hilarious at times and really visually just has this incredible style from scene to scene. I love the way this movie looks and have easily watched it way more than I think anything else on this list.
And
Yes, that is your hand. Very good.
we're all gonna die.
I hope so. Oh, for God's sake.
And then Russell Crowe again at my number 2 spot with Gladiator. Now there is a highly anticipated sequel to Gladiator coming out sometime soon. Russell Crowe has nothing to do with it, and if it goes the way of a lot of sequels, it's not going to be very good at all. But the original Gladiator is highly rewatchable and has just an incredible visual look to it. This movie was kind of an early adopter of CGI backgrounds in kind of a big way. In fact, there's a lot in this movie, and even though the movie itself is over 20 years old now, you cannot tell a lot of the times. Now, there's obviously some effects where you can, but this was so well done even back then that it still holds up really well today. Obviously, the story is amazing, but the look of this movie is really cool too. And in fact, just talking about it, I'm imagining so many different moments from it, and it has been a while since I've seen Gladiator. I'll be revisiting it with my new theater setup very soon. And then we've got my number 1 spot, and I'm not sure if the impending sequel has me hyped up so much to put this at number 1, or if Dune actually deserves this number 1 spot. Now visually, I loved the way that they handled this movie. It's got kind of this subtle approach that's just really refined and kind of beautiful to look at all the way through. But it also tells a very complex story with minimal words. Now, it's a fairly talky movie. There's a lot said, but they communicate a lot to you in this movie, again, with fairly few words. And I think that's really where the brilliance of Dune lies. Now, obviously, the production and just the costumes and everything is just top tier. It doesn't get a whole lot better than that. But again, the way that this complex story was sort of broken down and fed to you through the duration of this movie was, I think, pitch perfect. Brilliant way to do it, and I absolutely love the movie for that. I'm able to rewatch it, and I'm able to get a lot more out of it than just what people are saying. I'm able to understand a lot of the other things going on, and that is a tricky thing to pull off. I think they did it with Dune, and I cannot wait to see the sequel. But that is the list. Don't forget to go check out the Sundays link in the description to get that better food for your dog. But I will keep making videos like this one as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special Netflix episode, and you will see me on the next one.